the one that's not quite doing exactly what you really enjoy? Can you be anywhere? There always seems to be some limit on what you can do. So it's how we're looking at it, that every little obstacle from here to your next place you want to be, that you need to walk around, open doors, lift things, even the weight of your body could be an obstacle to that. Could be seen that way, but it doesn't have to be, you see. A belief could be a part of that imperative. In other words, there seems to be some compelling force. There seems to be an imperative, and then a belief is part of the structure of that imperative, whereas what we tend to think is that this is believed, but that belief is arising as a part of that imperative. And we move into the realms that really can't be expressed, and I guess it's part of the joy of exploring these things. Because we can see it from within the perspective of thought, and we can perhaps see it from without the perspective of thought. And so from within the perspective of thought, that's exactly what's happening. And you can witness the music arising, and the instrument being the instrument, and yourself being the instrument. So it's not just that there's this body and an ego creating music on the instrument, but it's part of a greater flow. I haven't had too many deep discussions on that particular topic, but it's enough if we can enter the space and actually play the music. And I've certainly done enough of that with other musicians without necessarily having the conversation around it. But then the result speaks for itself, because we haven't discussed what the music is going to be. So there's no way of either of us actually knowing what the end result is going to be. And yet, as you've heard, it's very coherent and can sound as though someone's composed it. And in some way it has been composed, but not necessarily by an individual that can claim that. Practical intents and purposes, we can obviously claim it because we recorded it and there's a record of it. But from a deeper perspective, we can't really claim that. However, I think there's something very special with another person, because a very important part of this is the personal experience, or the sense of personal experience of entering into that particular space. And so doing it together or in a group, then those people have perhaps a greater chance of observing that, or seeing it, or experiencing it, or creating. So there's something very special in doing it, either conversation or creating the music with another person or a group. And in a way, it's perhaps taking what used to be a very personal spiritual practice and seeing, well, how can we apply this? And in the case of music or conversation, it can be quite special. And the experience I quite often have with the music is that the piece of music is completed, it comes to a very natural close, we've recorded it, we listen back to it and have the sense of, hey, how did we do that? So we can enjoy it in the same way that an audience might enjoy it, because it's just been created there. We're hearing it for the first time. Yeah, these are areas really worth exploring from many different perspectives and revisiting. It's almost like going back to basics. So from one perspective, these things can seem very subtle and esoteric and refined, but from another perspective, it's as though we are really going back to basics before it all got confused, before it all got complicated. And We're being original by going back to origins, not just by being distracted by something that's new. Well, I found, for example, these birds that visit here are they have a certain kind of dignity about them, and they'll just sit patiently and they'll be just happy to sit with you. They'll literally fly in and just sit for a while, not always looking for food. The difference is in just seeing all of that activity arising and not being completely caught up in it. So it's almost as though you're seeing this unfolding, the activity unfolding. And quite often when that happens, then you might find that it just goes more smoothly, or it might be less hectic. Or you might find that you missed the bus and it was a good thing that you missed that bus. But that exists at every level. There are obstacles. As long as we see them as obstacles, then they're there. But really there's emotion, and it's all changing and it's all moving, and within all of that movement you're very still. Can we take that into that other situation? The one that's not quite doing exactly what you really enjoy. Can you be anywhere? There always seems to be some limit on what you can do. So it's how we're looking at it, that every little obstacle from here to your next place you want to be, that you need to walk around, open doors, lift things, could be an obstacle to that. Could be seen that way, but it doesn't have to be, you see. Imagining is unfolding just as magically as whatever it is that you perceive to be experiencing as a reality. And so it's then caught in that imagination, or that your attention is caught in the reality but either way they're both unfolding in the same magical way. It depends on how we resolve it, doesn't it? So it's not necessarily which note you play, but what you do with it, I guess, in a practical sense. So if we're then translating this into practical everyday life in relation to what's happening around me. So first of all, you've taken credit for doing something that perhaps you haven't even done. And then what can you do with that, or what flows from that? And then how does that resolve into everything that's happening around? What note they're going to play next? And there's no time to think about it, because they're both improvising at the same pace, which is quite often quite fast, and so many notes happening that there isn't time to stop and think what you're going to do next. How do all those dissonances become resolved into something that you enjoy listening to? And what we quite often miss is the fact that as these things are arising, flowing through the awareness, is that we're grabbing at them and we want to hang on to them. And the way we do that is by turning them into concepts. It ties it together from the perspective of not helpful once we want to perceive something beyond it. Perhaps many people struggle with. So that the actual formation of a concept is a kind of grasping. I'm not saying it's because otherwise we wouldn't have a conversation at all without the words, and the words are all concepts. So music can be a really good metaphor. Harmony, dissonance. And when we write a piece of music down on paper, then it's taking a very, very subtle arising and simplifying it into a concept. And likewise, when we take reality, an aspect of reality, down as a word, well, let's just stick with word for the time being. Then we've done the same thing. We've packaged it, and it requires then another mind to unpackage that. And particular concepts are quite often, or can pose a challenge for people who really want to understand them, or perhaps even won't, but I'll just say want to, but for some reason they're frustrated in some way by not quite getting it. So they're seeking different expressions of these, call them timeless truths, in different forms, in these words and in those words, and in different combinations of words, hoping to unpack the meaning from those. In a way that the mind suddenly gets it. But then we don't even have to think of these things as pointers, you see, because what we do is just enter the dance, enter the music. So that these concepts and the mind is seen as part of the activity, because we seem to be viewing everything through these concepts, through this activity, and once you step back, for lack of a better term, or outside of, or above, or beyond, or deeper within, then you notice that these thoughts and the mind are all part of that activity as well, that you were previously observing through the mind. So everything that you're experiencing now, the sound of the birds in the background, which the listeners might be able to hear, the movement of the leaves, which the viewers might be able to see, sound of the traffic, and sound of my words, and more importantly, their own thoughts about that. Those thoughts that they're having about that are just as much part of the movement as the leaves, the cars, the birds. You can look at it as something that's intentionally being done, or you can see it as something that's happening because the person is having an insight, or is expressing an insight into this realm. So the fact that they start to meditate half an hour a day, or the fact that they take out time to do some chanting or to read some books on these topics, is an expression of that awakening. Not that they're doing that in order to have an awakening, but it's an expression of their awakening. So there is this arising all the time, even if it doesn't look creative, even if it seems to be very rational. The professor writing his theory or something he has to complete his work in order to do a grant submission or a funding submission. So, while aspects seem very, very rational and very structured, ultimately they're part of a bigger, larger creative flow. I think the minute that they're interested in these kinds of topics, then it's inevitable that they'll see this arising nature, and then we can call it creative. We can call it something else, of course. In this conversation, we're calling it creative. So it's not necessarily a conversation about creative, because then people have concepts about what it is to be creative. Are you able to just see that creativity arising? Conceptualizing whatever it is that's arising. So the whole process turns in on itself and becomes ever more complex. And hence this running around, absolutely, languages, jargon, mathematics, all kinds of, any kind of language or symbolic representation does that. It's a running commentary on reality. And then they turn in on themselves to make commentaries on the sun's changed position, became very bright, we've moved, now it's behind clouds, we spoke, construction work started, and we stopped. So those things are arising, and then we're responding to that. It's interesting how the language works, that we say that we have a deep connection, when we could also just feel that it's there anyway, and suddenly there's an opening to that, and just a seeing of that that's there anyway. Just like when we talk about the stillness or pure awareness, or I sometimes use the words love, unconditional love, or inner peace, they're all meant to point to the same thing. That it's ever present, and then we become aware to it, or it shines through us. But then there's no point in changing the language around that, because you see what it is, and the seeing then makes the expression of that through language irrelevant. That's a beautiful phrase. And that's exactly what's happening. Stillness is speaking. Stillness is arising. Stillness is forming. So we keep stepping through layers of concepts to see that rather than think about it. Like being immersed in the water at the beach. Yeah. Being immersed in the water at the beach could be a metaphor for being immersed in thought. The water can still be there. It doesn't need to be a problem. And then as you're out on the dry shore, the water is still there. And it's not a problem. You're just not immersed in it. So it can be there and you can be immersed in it, or it can be there and you can not be immersed in it. There's no contradiction. It's just there. So when we relax, we're letting go. So it might even involve letting go of certain concepts and seeing if perhaps some other ones might arise that might be functional, or that maybe none is necessary for you to be doing what you're doing. So either you're relaxing your grip on the concept, or the concept is relaxing its grip on you. It doesn't really matter. Let's explore what you described as temptation, because that's very interesting that you made it so broad. Because these things that we often don't associate with temptation are in fact in some way tempting you to give them your attention. So it doesn't have to be something which people would normally associate with temptation, but simply just notice how this thought that's coming up, whatever it is about, is seeking your attention. And this is happening all the time with various thoughts. When you feel undecided, should I do this or should I do that? You're implying that someone might have the luxury of actually seeing it in that way. I agree that could be a really good description of what's happening, or making some comment, or making some judgment or some criticism. But just about everybody can look at it in hindsight, at least. Eventually you can look at it in hindsight. If you've reacted angrily, then, and eventually you might be able to see it as it's arising. Protect oneself or one's sense of worth. That's, unfortunately, being reactive like that is not helpful. But anyway, even someone who's reactive can reflect on this. But we don't see that energy arising because we're so caught in the thought forms and the temptation to make the correction and the temptation to perhaps enter a disagreement or an argument or a conflict, that we don't notice the whole energy that's arising, or how it can be avoided or resolved, or have it not arise in the first place. I'm sure some people do, but it probably takes the focus away from what's ultimately important and the setting within which these temptations are arising. So whether the temptation is there or whether it isn't there, whether it's for one thing or whether it's for another thing, there's some unnameable context within which that is arising. And so a large part of my interest in having these conversations is for the thoughts and the concepts to somehow create an opening, fall away, or to express that particular broader context of inner peace or pure awareness or stillness. So that if we're talking about the temptation or not temptation or competing temptations, that having that conversation, we're aware that there is this backdrop against which it's happening, out of which it's arising. And so once we move into that space of that, from where it's arising, then the conversation about it seems to answer itself. We're no longer trying to answer it from an intellectual perspective. Then we can just see it as we're very much in the moment, and the words are arising and this activity is arising, and so it's no longer a temptation. When we fall back into concepts, then we think of, okay, well, this thought is wanting our attention, that thought is wanting our attention. So actually then analysing what's going on in the mind, opposed to that thought, and then being aware that then that's happening within this wider field of stillness or pure awareness. It's not as though we have to suddenly do everything in slow motion. We have the opportunity to sit here and take our time around this conversation. But then there are other times when we need to be moving pretty quickly. But we can still be aware that we're in that stillness while we're moving quickly. And someone else might think, oh, Richard's stressed, or whereas he's just moving quickly and he's quite aware that he's in that stillness. And he's quite aware that everything is just moving around that stillness, including his own body.